The Middle Ages were shaped not just by kings and castles, but by warriors who fought without hesitation and ruled through force. In a time where battles were personal and survival demanded brutality, some fighters stood out for their sheer ferocity. These men didn't follow chivalry. They bent it, broke it, and replaced it with fear. From ruthless commanders to relentless knights, this is a look at the most brutal medieval fighters in history, ranked and explained. Number 1. Jeffroy de Charny. Jeffroy de Charny stood as one of the most emblematic and fearsome knights of the 14th century, a figure who fully embodied the brutal, unforgiving world of medieval warfare. Unlike many nobles of his time who clung to romanticized ideals of knighthood from behind castle walls, Jeffroy lived his code through action, on bloodied battlefields, in scorched towns, and during desperate charges where survival meant meeting violence with something even more relentless. His life wasn't polished or ceremonial. It was forged in mud, sweat, fire, and steel. He rose through the ranks not just by noble birth, but by sheer will and undeniable skill with arms. By the time he gained significant command, Jeffroy had already proven himself in countless skirmishes and campaigns. The 100 Years' War gave him no shortage of opportunities, and he embraced nearly all of them. He fought in sieges that lasted months, enduring starvation and sickness alongside his men, and led raids, known as chevauchées, deep into enemy lands. These weren't quick battles for glory. They were long, drawn-out operations meant to cripple regions. His troops would burn granaries, poison wells, destroy fields, and slaughter livestock. The goal wasn't just to win on the battlefield, it was to starve the enemy, to collapse morale, to make civilians flee before a sword was even drawn. And Jeffroy didn't shy away from leading these assaults himself. He wasn't content to send others into danger while he observed from behind the lines. He was often in the first wave, his armor darkened by soot, and his sword drawn before the horns finished sounding. He fought with precision and aggression, often cutting down more than his fair share before the melee even peaked. His reputation as a brutal field commander came not from cruelty for cruelty's sake, but from the cold efficiency with which he carried out war. He understood something many knights of his era refused to admit. Real warfare wasn't a tournament. It was about survival, dominance, and the destruction of opposition, no matter how noble or dishonorable the means might appear. Throughout his career, Jeffroy was captured multiple times. Being taken prisoner in medieval warfare often meant waiting in miserable conditions while someone negotiated your ransom. But each time he was released or paid for, he returned to battle, more determined and seasoned than before. These weren't defeats, they were lessons, and Jeffroy learned fast. He adapted his leadership style, tightened his strategies, and demanded a level of discipline from his men that reflected his own unbreakable mentality. His final battle, the one that truly cemented his legacy, was fought at Poitiers in 1356, a clash that became one of the most significant encounters of the entire war. By that point, Jeffroy had become the bearer of the royal oriflamme, the sacred battle standard traditionally carried by a chosen knight into the most dangerous part of the fight. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a statement. Carrying the oriflamme meant you accepted death before surrender. You didn't flee, you didn't fall back. And that's exactly what he did. As the battle raged and the tide turned against his side, Jeffroy moved to the center of the chaos, the flaming red banner held high even as the ground was littered with the bodies of comrades. Surrounded, outnumbered, and with the command structure collapsing around him, he refused all offers to yield. He didn't break rank. He didn't hand over the banner. Instead, he fought step by step, with every ounce of strength left in his body, until he was finally cut down where he stood, defiant to the very end. Some said his hands still gripped the pole as his body hit the ground. What made Jeffroy de Charny's legacy so brutal was not just the battles he fought or the enemies he defeated, but the way he turned violence into ritual, into duty. Every blow he struck was part of something larger, the defense of an idea, the execution of a strategy, the acceptance that war in his time required steel not just in the hand, but in the soul. He wasn't fearless, no fighter truly is, but he faced fear with absolute clarity. And in doing so, he became one of the most feared and respected warriors of his age. Number 2, Jean de la Bome. Jean de la Bome was not a man forged in royal courts or knightly tournaments. His legacy was shaped in scorched fields, crumbling towns, and the ashes of villages left behind by his mercenary companies. Active during the early 15th century, a time marked by political chaos and shifting allegiances, he thrived in the cracks where order failed and violence became the only reliable currency. Unlike many high-born commanders of his age, Jean didn't rely on ancient family prestige or oaths of loyalty to fuel his campaigns. Instead, he built his strength on discipline, intimidation, and an absolute willingness to do whatever was necessary to seize and maintain control. He often served under multiple crowns, shifting alliances depending on contracts and opportunity. To some, he was a commander for hire. To others, a warlord in all but name. His forces were primarily mercenaries, professional soldiers who didn't answer to feudal codes or romantic ideals of chivalry. They were loyal to coin, not cause. Under Jean's command, they became a hammer that struck with brutal efficiency, unconcerned with the collateral damage left behind. Where they passed, order broke down, and resistance was crushed before it could take shape. Entire regions fell silent, not because they had been pacified, but because fear alone was enough to keep people from speaking. Jean was known to use terror deliberately as a tool of warfare. When entering rebellious territories, his response to any resistance, real or imagined, was swift and theatrical. Captured enemies were often mutilated in public squares, their dismembered bodies left as warnings nailed to gates or suspended from trees. He made sure that word of his punishments traveled faster than his troops did. This psychological edge gave him an advantage before swords were ever drawn. Villages often surrendered at the mere rumor of his approach. Nobles either paid him tribute to spare their lands or abandoned their holdings entirely, knowing that defending them would mean facing a merciless siege followed by no chance of negotiation. His campaigns were not grand, decisive battles recorded in royal chronicles, but rather drawn-out campaigns of attrition, control, and punishment. His forces specialized in chevauchées. Deep raids into rural territories meant not only to strip the enemy of resources, but to break the spirit of the land itself. They would destroy grain stores, poison wells, burn thatched homes, and cut down orchards. These weren't acts of random cruelty, they were deliberate methods of depriving the enemy of the ability to recover. In the brutal logic of medieval warfare, denying food was as effective as any sword. While some may argue that Jean de la Bome lacked the honor of the more noble-minded knights of his time, there is little question that he understood the brutal reality of the world he fought in. His name became synonymous with devastation, not because of any one glorious victory, but because his methodical violence left behind a trail that reshaped regions for years after his campaigns ended. For the people who lived beneath his shadow, there was no myth, only memory, carved in fire and blood. Number 3, Bertrron de Pulongji. Bertrron de Pulongji's name may not ring with the same weight as legendary knights or battlefield commanders carved into stone, but for those who marched beside him, especially during some of the fiercest engagements of the 15th century, he was a figure to be remembered not for grand speeches or titles, but for steel, resolve, and raw brutality in combat. Where others hesitated behind walls of protocol and chivalric pageantry, Bertrron moved forward without pause, driven not by politics or glory, but by a grim determination to win, or at the very least to survive by cutting down anything in his path. He was a knight who stood at the edge of legend, not at its center, but close enough to feel its heat. Known most for riding alongside Joan of Arc during her extraordinary campaign, Bertrron didn't bask in the spotlight of prophecy or divine guidance. Instead, he did the work others avoided, the kind of fighting where chainmail clings to wet skin, where the air stinks of burnt timber and open wounds, and where victory often depends on who can push a dagger deeper into the gaps of another man's armor. During the lifting of the siege of Orléans, one of the most intense urban battles of the time, Bertrron played a crucial role in what was essentially street-to-street and house-to-house warfare. Unlike open-field battles where cavalry and banners dominated, this was close-quarter butchery in narrow alleys and burning buildings. The fighting was savage. Men were dragged from staircases, swords clashed in doorways, and wounded soldiers often drowned in rising mud mixed with blood and sewage. In this chaos, Bertrron was not just present, he was leading. When others fell back, blinded by smoke or fear, he pushed forward, rallying with brutal efficiency. There was no room for hesitation. He fought with short, sharp strikes meant to kill quickly, efficiently, and permanently. Veterans of those campaigns later spoke of how Bertrron fought like someone who'd accepted death, and in doing so, no longer feared it. That made him dangerous. He moved through the battlefield with a controlled aggression, striking from angles most wouldn't consider, unafraid to grab, drag, and finish an enemy face to face. His weapon of choice was often a short sword or a heavy-bladed dagger, perfect for gutting an opponent in tight quarters or finishing off a wounded soldier when no time could be spared. He wasn't the kind of knight who boasted. He didn't seek recognition. But what he lacked in fame, he made up for in reliability. The kind of fighter you wanted next to you when the line broke, when your shield cracked, when the flames closed in. Bertrron de Pulongji may not have commanded legions, but his strength lay in being unshakable in the blood-soaked center of the fray. His name didn't echo through court halls, but in the screams and clashes of real war, it carried weight. Number 4, Etienne de Vinol. Etienne de Vinol, more widely known by the name La Hire, was not the kind of commander who inspired calm or comfort. He inspired fear, both in his enemies and sometimes even among his own men. His presence on the battlefield was as much psychological as it was physical. He wasn't refined, didn't care for noble gestures or ritualized codes of war. What he valued was action, direct, brutal, and immediate. When others gathered for councils or debated the terms of surrender, La Hire was already tightening his gauntlets, sharpening his blade, and planning the fastest route to break down the gate. He embodied a kind of war that was personal, merciless, and always a few degrees hotter than anyone around him could endure. His loyalty to the Dauphin was absolute, but his method of proving it often came through fire and destruction rather than strategy or statecraft. He made his name in a time when France was fractured and chaos ruled more than any crown. In this broken landscape, La Hire became a storm, unpredictable, savage, and unstoppable when unleashed. His troops followed him not because he was gentle or inspiring, but because he led from the front and punished hesitation. When he rode into a town that resisted, there were no second chances. Fires were set, walls were broken, and those who held out too long were left with nothing to surrender but rubble and ash. He fought alongside Joan of Arc during the key campaigns, and though their personalities could not have been more different, their partnership worked because both believed in decisive action. While Joan brought divine fire and rallying faith, La Hire brought steel and fury. His tactics were often based on sheer speed and violence, launching sudden assaults, striking at dawn when enemies were still half-dressed, or raiding supply lines when no one expected movement. He didn't wait for permission or second guesses. Once he smelled blood or weakness, he pounced. There was something raw and unfiltered about La Hire that made him stand out, even among a generation of hardened knights. He cursed freely, even in the presence of priests, and was known to pray in a way that bordered on blasphemous. Before battle, he once reportedly said, "Lord, I beg you to do well by me today, for you know I am in the right, and if you don't, well then, don't let the devil have me either." That kind of audacity wasn't a joke. It was who he was. He charged into battle like a man who didn't believe death could catch him, and more often than not, he was right. But what made La Hire truly terrifying wasn't just his brutality. It was his unpredictability. One day he might lead a formal assault with perfect discipline. The next, he could challenge an enemy leader to single combat, right in front of their army. He fought like every battle was personal. For him, there was no line between soldier and executioner, between victory and vengeance. And while many knights of his era hoped to be remembered as honorable, La Hire seemed to embrace the opposite. He didn't need to be liked, only feared. Number 5. Rodrigo Diaz de Asturias. Rodrigo Diaz de Asturias, a name often overshadowed by the legendary El Cid, was nonetheless a formidable figure in the violent and unforgiving world of the 12th century Iberian Peninsula. He carved out a reputation not through grand tales or poetic embellishments, but through the grim effectiveness of his methods on the battlefield and in the harsh terrain of a fractured land. His campaigns unfolded during the period of the Christian Reconquest, an era when warfare was constant, alliances were brittle, and survival demanded more than strength. It required calculation, cruelty, and an iron will. Rodrigo was shaped by the unforgiving environment he fought in. Arid plains, rocky passes, and scattered hilltop fortresses that rarely fell without bloodshed. He wasn't a courtly knight draped in silks. He was a battle-worn commander who understood that logistics, fear, and psychological pressure were just as deadly as swords and spears. His forces often operated deep in enemy territory, cut off from consistent reinforcements, living off what they could scavenge or seize. This forced him to fight with a ruthless clarity. No prolonged sieges if starvation could do the work. No negotiations when mutilation sent a louder message. One of the hallmarks of Rodrigo's campaign style was his use of isolation as a weapon. He focused on breaking the enemy long before the walls fell or the gates were breached. Water sources were diverted or poisoned, wells were seized early, and fields around a targeted town were burned to prevent harvest or retreat. When he approached a settlement, he didn't rely on declarations or messengers. Instead, he sent visible, brutal warnings. Hands cut from captured scouts, nailed to wooden stakes, and planted in the soil outside the gates. These weren't the acts of a sadist. They were deliberate messages, announcing that surrender might spare a town, but resistance guaranteed it would be erased. Rodrigo understood the value of speed and intimidation. He rarely allowed his troops to be drawn into set-piece battles unless absolutely necessary. Ambushes in narrow valleys, forced marches under the midday sun, and midnight assaults on weakly guarded positions were all part of his repertoire. His men, hardened by hunger and hardened by his discipline, followed him because he didn't waste lives in showy charges or symbolic victories. Every move he made served a purpose, and every act of cruelty was part of a broader design to unnerve the enemy and preserve his strength. What made Rodrigo particularly feared was not the scale of destruction he unleashed, but the cold consistency with which he applied pressure. He didn't shout orders, he expected them to be followed. When defenders surrendered quickly, they were sometimes spared. When they resisted, their towns were broken brick by brick. The survivors marched away in chains or left to the vultures. His legend grew not because he sought fame, but because he represented a kind of warfare that stripped away illusion and left only consequences. In a time where power was always contested and peace was a temporary illusion, Rodrigo Diaz de Asturias became the embodiment of a commander who wielded brutality not as a vice but as a strategy. Number 6. Guy de Lusignan. Guy de Lusignan remains one of the most controversial and tragic figures of the later crusading era. A man whose legacy was shaped not by heroic triumphs, but by catastrophic failure and the haunting aftermath that followed. Often remembered more for the crown he wore than the blade he wielded, Guy's role as a military leader during the Battle of Hattin placed him at the heart of one of the most brutal collapses ever suffered by the crusading armies. His story is not one of noble victories or brilliant tactics. It is a story of desperation, miscalculation, and the savage price paid when leadership falters in the face of relentless, determined opposition. Crowned through marriage to Queen Sibylla, Guy stepped into a kingdom already on the edge of crisis. Political divisions tore through the ruling elite, rival factions bled authority, and tensions with Saladin's expanding forces escalated with every passing season. When war finally ignited in full, Guy found himself thrust into command of a kingdom whose military strength was fractured and whose resources were dangerously limited. Yet, despite warnings and the unbearable heat of summer, he made the fateful decision to march his army across dry, open terrain toward a confrontation that would test and break the very core of Crusader power in the Holy Land. The march to Hattin was grueling. Guy's army, made up of mounted knights, infantry, and members of the great military orders, struggled under the scorching sun. Water sources were few, morale plummeted, and Saladin's forces, knowing the terrain and timing perfectly, encircled and harassed the column relentlessly. Exhausted and parched, the Crusaders reached the horns of Hattin, a rocky plateau that offered little in terms of shelter or strategic advantage. Trapped and dehydrated, they formed defensive lines, but the enemy had already won the initiative. The battle that followed was more slaughter than clash. Surrounded on all sides, choking on smoke from grass fires lit deliberately by Saladin's men, the Crusaders broke under the weight of hunger, thirst, and continuous assault. Men collapsed where they stood, shields dropped, horses fell in panic. The famed knights who had once stood invincible in battle were hacked down or captured, and the banners of Christendom were trampled underfoot. Guy was taken alive, but the fate of many who followed him was far worse. Hundreds of captured knights, particularly those from the Templars and Hospitallers, were executed in the days that followed, beheaded in front of their comrades in grim processions that turned defeat into a massacre. It is said that Guy was forced to watch the executions, powerless to intervene, his authority shattered along with the remnants of his army. The defeat at Hattin didn't just mark the loss of a battle, it triggered the fall of Jerusalem and a complete shift in the balance of power in the region. And at the center of that spiral stood Guy, burdened with the weight of command, his name forever tied to the disaster. He didn't die by the sword, but the thousands who did under his banner left behind a legacy of ruin soaked in blood, dust, and silence. Number 7, Baldwin IV's captains. During one of the most volatile periods of the Crusades, when the balance of power in the Eastern territories was under constant threat, it wasn't always kings who held the front lines. It was the captains who rode in their names. Baldwin IV, known to history as the Leper King, ruled with remarkable clarity despite his debilitating illness. But as his health declined, he increasingly relied on the strength, speed, and brutality of his chosen commanders to enforce control, carry out strategic assaults, and defend a fragile kingdom, surrounded by enemies on every border. These men, often overshadowed by the rulers they served, became enforcers of a grim and unforgiving form of warfare, one that favored sudden impact over drawn-out defense and absolute ruthlessness over restraint. The captains who served Baldwin IV weren't conventional in their methods. They didn't wait for formal declarations or parade in shining armor before sieges. They used the element of surprise, the cover of night, and the precision of small mobile forces to strike hard and vanish. They moved across rough terrain with purpose, targeting supply lines, merchant caravans, and lightly defended outposts. These were not symbolic gestures of power. They were tactical moves meant to destabilize, confuse, and cripple the enemy before larger armies could even be assembled. When they entered hostile territory, it wasn't with the hope of negotiation. It was to leave a message in blood and smoke. Among these commanders, one figure stands out for the sheer intensity of his actions: Renaud de Chatillon. Renaud was not simply a military leader. He was an embodiment of fury and unpredictability. With a reputation that fluctuated between reckless and fearless, he broke rules that even other war-hardened knights dared not touch. One of his most notorious acts was launching an unprovoked raid during an active truce, targeting not enemy soldiers but a caravan of merchants and civilians. The attack was devastating. Entire families were slaughtered, and the goods intended for peaceful trade were taken or destroyed. It wasn't just a breach of peace, it was a provocation so severe it rippled through the entire region. This act, and others like it, helped ignite the rage of Saladin, who had been cautiously respecting diplomatic agreements until then. Reynald's blatant disregard for truce and his unapologetic use of cruelty as strategy made him an object of both fear and hatred. His actions weren't dismissed as the madness of a rogue knight. They were calculated, aggressive maneuvers in a game of survival where delay meant defeat. When Renaud was finally captured in a later battle, Saladin made no political gesture. He executed him personally, delivering the punishment with his own hand, a rare and direct act for a ruler of his stature. Baldwin IV's captains reflected the harsh truths of crusader rule in foreign lands. With limited manpower, stretched resources, and threats on every horizon, these commanders did what they believed was necessary to maintain control. Their brutality wasn't theatrical, it was survival. They burned first and asked questions never. They led men who didn't expect to return. And they operated in a time when mercy was not only rare but dangerous. These were warriors forged by pressure, hardened by distance from home, and defined not by banners or ballads but by the shadows they cast as they rode into the dust. Number 8. Hugh de Lacy. In the brutal landscape of 12th century frontier warfare, few figures embodied the cold, calculated use of force quite like Hugh de Lacy. He wasn't simply a warrior, he was a land grabber, a strategist, and above all, a man who understood that in contested lands, power wasn't held with treaties or banners, but with stone walls, gallows, and fire. His name became tied not just to the building of castles, but to the hard reality of what those castles represented: conquest, suppression, and total dominance over populations that had no desire to be ruled by him or any outsider. Hugh de Lacy rose to prominence in regions riddled with rebellion, where local rulers resisted foreign control, and where loyalty had to be enforced rather than assumed. He didn't wait for permission to act. He carved out authority with his own hands, often by the sword. What made Hugh stand apart was his understanding that military might had to be permanent. He didn't just win battles, he held territory. And to hold it, he built. Fortress after fortress rose in his wake, each one strategically placed to overlook roads, rivers, valleys, any passage where resistance might organize or where trade might flow. These weren't symbolic seats of power, they were forward bases of enforcement. From these high stone keeps, his soldiers patrolled like wolves, watching, pressuring, punishing. But Hugh wasn't satisfied with passive control. His campaigns were marked by deliberate acts of devastation meant to cripple both the spirit and the means of rebellion. When locals defied him, the answer came not with a negotiation, but with flames. He ordered fields put to the torch, granaries destroyed, livestock scattered or slaughtered, entire harvests lost in a single day. Villages suspected of harboring resistance didn't receive trials. They were made examples. Leaders were taken and executed publicly, hung from trees where their bodies would rot in the sun, or beheaded and left where others would be forced to see them every day. These weren't impulsive cruelties. They were part of a consistent system of fear management. What Hugh understood with precision was that terror was as effective as the sword. He created zones of control where silence replaced rebellion, not because hearts were won, but because voices were choked off. People learned not to speak too loudly, not to gather after nightfall, not to hold on to old banners hidden under floorboards. His men enforced his rule with strict discipline, but that discipline was built on violence. If a patrol was ambushed, the nearby village might be razed. If a castle came under siege, supplies were cut off to surrounding farms until the locals turned on their own in desperation. De Lacy's legacy is written not just in stone, but in the scorched earth that surrounded his conquests. While some praised him as a stabilizer, others cursed his name in hushed tones. But whether feared or loathed, he was undeniably effective. The lands he claimed often went quiet, not because peace had been achieved, but because resistance had been crushed so completely that only survival remained. His rule was not gentle, but it was enduring. In the chaos of medieval power struggles, Hugh de Lacy made it clear: stability could be built with mortar, but it was maintained with iron.